Welcome to Let's Hear It.
Let's Hear It is a podcast for and about the field of foundation and nonprofit communications, produced by its two co-hosts, Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. No relation.
Well said, Eric, and I'm Kirk.
And I'm Eric.
The podcast is sponsored by the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
We're talking to people about their work and what's happening in the field with the hopes of making this growing arena just a little bit more accessible to us all.
You can find Let's Hear It on any podcast subscription platform. You can find us on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast, and you can email us at hello@letshearitcast.com.
Let us know if you have any thoughts about what you hear today, including people we should have on the show.
And if you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find us.
So let's get on to the show.
And welcome in. You found us. We're glad to have you here. Welcome back. It's another edition of Let's Hear It. So glad you could join us. Hope you're happy, safe, secure, doing good things with your time. And Mr. Brown, as always, good to see you as well.
Doing good things with your time?
Yeah, like listening to Let's Hear It. Going for a walk, cleaning the house.
What are you, my productivity coach?
Spending some time at the gym. Yeah, just reflecting.
That's what I do.
And listening to Let's Hear It. That's what's happening.
Hi, Kirk.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm very good.
I really appreciate...
I'm doing good things with my time.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. Clearly. Because you've got another one for us. Tell us about who we're going to hear from today. I can't. Okay, this has got to be the beginning.
Calm down. It's okay. You'll blow a gasket. You'll end up not doing good things with your time.
This is the beginning, I feel like, of a multi-part series of conversations we need to have on Let's Hear It. Let me just say that. Okay. Because this is a mighty one. It's a mighty discussion.
Thank you for committing me to more work.
As always.
As always. So my guest today is Jasmine Banks.
Yes.
Who's the executive director of UnKoch My Campus, which is an organization that's working to protect higher education from undue donor influence. And Koch isn't Coca-Cola. It's spelled K-O-C-H as in Koch brothers, Koch stuff. She recently released a report that was called Koch-Funded Moral Panic, Ultra-Right Think Tanks, and Critical Race Theory. So that got our attention here at the global offices of Let's Hear It. Because we've been talking so much about communications and race and how people have been, and the challenges that have been placed in front of folks. And now here we have somebody who's kind of calling it out, calling the question. And we got excited about that and just had to speak to Jasmine Banks.
So timely, so generous. As Jasmine describes herself in her bio, a first-generation high school and university graduate, she understands the critical role that all education plays in shaping our democracy. She's a mother of four, a passionate supporter of her queer Black community, and an eternal fan of Beyonce, according to her bio. This is Jasmine Banks on Let's Hear It. Thank you for joining us.
Welcome to Let's Hear It. Oh boy, folks. This is going to be a good one. I'm so happy to introduce my guest today, Jasmine Banks, who's the executive director of UnKoch My Campus, which is an organization that's working to protect higher education from undue donor influence. Jasmine, thank you again for coming. Why don't you give us a little intro to UnKoch My Campus?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. As you said, my name is Jasmine Banks. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from beautiful Arkansas, which is the Cherokee, Muskogee, Caddo Nation folks. So UnKoch My Campus is started ultimately as a student campaign that grew into something so much bigger. But the ultimate intention of UnKoch My Campus is to understand that there is a political strategy by Charles Koch and his broader network, a loose configuration of think tanks and academics and lobbyists and corporations, to utilize the institution of higher education as a site of idea reproduction, because they understand that the material outcomes of our lawmaking, whether it's cultural or codified, that they all start within higher education at the university campus. And so for the last 50 years, Charles Koch and his cadre of wealthy radical capitalists, they like to call themselves free market economics and libertarians. I see it as a form of radical racialized capitalism. They've been making investments underneath the guise of philanthropy, the 501c3 designation. And whether there's direct strings attached or implied strings attached, the material outcomes of all of their political activity in private and for public and private universities is to, basically roll back any kind of progress we've made and to advance a very social, economic, regressive agenda. So UnKoch organized students, faculties, community members, and folks who care about preserving higher education to make a better world rather than protect corporate private interests.
Well, this is such an interesting conversation because it really brings together this notion of narrative, kind of controlling the narrative, and the role of philanthropy to advance or to, in some instances, thwart social causes.
Yeah.
I was having this conversation with my pal and co-conspirator Kirk Brown about this notion of critical race theory, because we have been reading the paper and seeing all these things about how the right is attempting to basically take the idea of critical race theory and make it a problem. Mm-hmm. And as we were having this conversation, lo and behold, a piece by you pops up in The Nation called "The Radical Capitalist Behind the Critical Race Theory Furor: How a Dark Money Mogul Bankrolled an AstroTurf Backlash," and which drove us to your report called "Koch-Funded Moral Panic: Ultra-Right Think Tanks and Critical Race Theory." So, as someone who's, I don't tend to have the first idea first, you were way ahead of us. I mean, obviously, there had to be something behind this, and lo and behold, there's lots behind this. But I would like to back up there for those of folks out there who are not really read into this conversation. Can you start with talking a little bit about what critical race theory is, and then take us into how has it become twisted into something that people are saying is you can take us to where that's going to go.
Yeah, well, certainly I'm not the critical race theory expert, although, as a Black, queer, Indigenous woman in Arkansas with multiple different identities, I appreciate the importance of critical race theory as a framework and analysis for how structural oppression operates. But Kimberly Crenshaw should definitely be the person that folks look up around critical race theory. But as much as I understand it from a lay perspective, is that really it is an analytical lens for the law and for critiquing structural power and systemic power. What I do know is that critical race theory is not taught in schools. And that's where this really powerful tactic in narrative shift is, right? That anything that these bases want to use as a moral panic becomes whatever it is, right? DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, social emotional learning is another thing that they latch on to, or gender affirming is another thing that they latch on to. And so ultimately, in this context, this conversation, critical race theory is a Trojan horse for dog whistling to very specific base that will create some panic and destabilize efforts in public education. Hopefully, did I hit the nail on the head for you?
Yes. Well, obviously, what we have been, I think we also mentioned this on the show recently, that after the murder of George Floyd, an understanding of structural racism has, even references to it have exploded, that people are now kind of it took 400 years to put two and two together, but it equals four, which is that structural racism has had this incredibly insidious effect on every part of our culture. And but my reading of critical race theory is that stuff has become kind of adopted into, that structural racism has become adopted into the law and obviously into all of the social institutions that we understand. And if you were paying attention at all in the last year, you've seen how people are starting to understand that structural racism is driving so much of our daily experience, and that we've got to do something about it if we want to live in a just society. And apparently that's a problem.
Well, for a property supremacist like Charles Koch, it is a problem, right? If you believe that, the market fixes everything, and if you have wealth, you should be able to control everything, and you want to capture institutions, then something like critical race theory provides an analytical narrative antidote to this idea that the markets are fair, right? If you talk about that, the market was actually, the economy was built off of Black and Indigenous death and suffering, and that war is, needed to continue to create wealth for the ultra wealthy. Those are all things that a very laser sharp analysis with critical race theory can provide you. And so who wants that out in the masses, right? And the fact of the matter is, in all of the primary sources, in any place in space where you look at Charles Koch and the folks he's closest with, their analysis, they understand it's not popular. Think back to For the People Act and Jane Mayer's breaking piece about how Koch operatives were talking about, well, in our marketing and our messaging, turns out people are supportive of billionaires not buying elections. And so we got to figure out a different tactic. And so they said an under the dome tactic and killing it under the dome. And so they do their research. They understand that if the masses truly get what their strategy is, that they will not have support for it. So they have to astroturf, they have to utilize disinformation, and then they have to appeal to authoritarian movements and these very populist movements in order to get their version of the world realized, right? They're organizing in the same way we're organizing, but they're only organizing for a small number of folks to survive and experience a vibrant, beautiful life. I would say it's a soul barren life. I think there's some spiritual implications for why they have the worldviews that they have. But ultimately, it's just about control and domination at the cost of everyone else.
I heard a quote by Anand Giridharadas, who's a commenter on philanthropy. He said, I think we shouldn't have any billionaires. We should try that. And if it doesn't work out, we can go back to having billionaires. But
yeah, who's signing up for that experiment? We need to do that. What is that? Let's just landscape it real quick. We'll get a quick data set. We'll run the messaging.
That's right. A lot of people out there is like, what we really need is more billionaires. It's just not enough billionaires because they're really good. Can you talk, Jasmine, about how you came to this work? What is your personal journey that got you to this place right now?
I grew up in Oklahoma, a single mom. I actually grew up in this place called the Charles Page Family Village, which is an interesting experiment of what happens when people who have massive wealth actually use all of their wealth to transform. And so there's this man named Charles Page. He had this incredible endowment and trust fund, and he was a Christian and believed that the true gospel is taking care of the widow and the orphan. So he created this multi-housing place. It spans acres, that if you are widowed or divorced with 2 or more children, you can live in this facility, and it's just like a duplex, multiple duplexes, until your youngest child graduates high school. You never pay rent, you never pay utilities. You're just asked to have housing inspections so that you're keeping the property clean. You share cleaning up the grounds, like taking out the trash and keeping things clean. And there's no alcohol and no men after midnight. It was an interesting place, but I had never had a permanent home up until that moment. And so growing up homeless, I experienced this whole juxtaposition of what happens when the rise of corporations and neoliberalism sell something to you, right? Like this belief of, if you just make good grades, you just go to college and get student loans to go to college, you can get a job and be better, right? So fast forward to now, I am massively in debt, had moved into movement work, felt the pressures of the nonprofit industrial complex and not doing well. And so I was like, I'll just go out on my own. I love comms. I love messaging. I'm going to apply to this as a digital contractor for UnKoch, my campus. And I'll do corporate accountability and undue donor influence because it has nothing to do with my real life. It'll never have any implications, right? Because I was doing racial justice work and I was doing maternal mental health and reproductive rights work. And it was just taxing as a person who has my background and my story. It felt like always dealing with my own trauma. So I applied, got the job, and took 2 weeks to read all of their reports, all of the work. And I'd never heard of Charles Koch before. And I was like, how is it? I thought I was going to just continue to do good work that was sort of removed from the real implications of my life. And I happened on the Death Star of all of the things that I had been organizing to intervene in other places, whether it was climate or repro rights or whatever, all has Charles Koch's fingerprints on it. There's not a voter suppression or an education issue or a clean water issue that somehow is not connected to his efforts to privatize and sort of create this free market, utopia for himself. And so that's sort of the vast picture of how I got into this. And I always tell people that so much about the material conditions of my life bring me in a direct conflict with the world that Charles Koch is trying to create. And it's one of those fights for survival, right? If he gets his way, people like me and my family will not exist. And so, I offered the example of Charles Page versus the Charles Koch. Is Charles Page believed that all of his wealth was to help everyone else live and survive. And his generosity and true philanthropy was the thing that helped me get to this place where I have some kind of privileges, some kind of comfort, was because I had a home that my mom didn't have to pay for. And I got to be able to go to university. I was the first person in my family to graduate high school, let alone get to college and then a master's degree. And it was all because of that living situation. And they reversed over here. And this other Charles story is that we should all have to be going into debt, that we should all be, relying on private interests to help us see our way through. Right. So these really interesting moments and these vector points in my life converge. And now here I am throwing rocks at billionaires from Arkansas.
A tale of two Charleses. That's so interesting that you are, well, okay, can we talk a little bit about why higher education for you is that crux, that central operating system for this work? Because you could pick it a million entry points to how are we going to shift the culture? How are we going to create justice? And you're working on improving higher education. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think there's a lot of conversation around the neoliberal university and how it actually, reproduces class struggle and stratifies us and creates more oppression. But what I know about education is that it is a site for transformation. It can be reimagined to be the common good that it ought to be, right? It's a public good for us. We ought to be going into these institutions, thinking through ideas together, wrestling with these things, and then producing something that's the betterment for not just ourselves, but our communities. And right now, it's just a place of creating administration and creating workers or creating bosses. And so I really believe that a progressive future, a world that has, a beloved state and all the things that I'm hoping for and my colleagues and co-conspirators are working for, requires education being protected as a public institution forever. And so that's the short answer.
If you were a betting person, would you say that is a possibility? That's something that's within our sights? Are you confident or hopeful that we can help shape education in such a way that it really does build lives?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Or else I wouldn't keep having children and putting them in public education. So there's that. But also, it's important for us to think about our opposition and their messages and narratives and why education is so important for them. So much of the utilizing education and controlling it and privatizing it and then using it as a site of reproduction was inspired for Charles Koch during, the James McGill Buchanan and Milton Friedman years. The Powell memo is also sort of woven in there, and understanding that many of these folks have decided to privatize and capture education because it was a direct response to Brown versus Board of Education, right? If it's not that big of a deal, right? If it's not valuable, why do you have, generations of white nationalists and neo-Confederates working really hard to resegregate? And they're doing so through school choice. They're doing so through this idea of charter. And, this actually helps Black people because then they have more choices. But then if you use critical race theory for an analysis, you understand that actually it doesn't. It has the opposite effect. And so, I think that people ought to have, beautiful choices. And I think that if folks want private choices to exist, that's fine. But let's make sure that the public choices that we have are fully supported and they haven't been deregulated and gutted in such a way that it sets up this false comparison of competition, right? Let's make sure that individual folks aren't subsidizing what the state and federal level should be providing for us as a public good with our own private debt. those are the things that need to be transformed. And I think we're on that way, right? Even with Biden's administration recently canceling student debt for folks who have severe disabilities that keep them from meaningful income. By the way, Biden could cancel student debt today and ought to do so, right? So I absolutely believe that the institution of education and learning is a powerful, powerful piece of our puzzle of a more beautiful, just society.
Well, we're going to take a quick break with Jasmine Banks, the executive director of UnKoch My Campus. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Let's Hear It, a podcast about foundation and nonprofit communications hosted by Kirk Brown and Eric Brown. Let's Hear It is sponsored by the Communications Network, which connects, gathers, and informs the field of leaders working in communications for good. Because foundations and nonprofits that communicate well are stronger, smarter, and vastly more effective. You can find Let's Hear It online at letshearitcast.com or on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show. And we are back with Jasmine Banks, the executive director of UnKoch My Campus. I was okay. Did a rant. I was ranting. I have a tendency to rant a little bit when I saw a university talking about how it is a selective university, and it just got my blood boiling because, yeah, sure. If you grew up and you didn't have to work 2 jobs as a kid, if you had tutors, if you got to take the test prep things, if you had an uncle or a parent or something who went to the university, then that university, and it picks you, then it's selective. And to me, that's just like, these are restrictive universities because they are restricted to people who have had these opportunities to be able to do all those things that they got to do to get in. How do we undo that? How do we help these institutions of higher education understand that there is no such thing as selectivity, and how do we establish this framework that everyone should have a true opportunity to succeed? Am I just getting crazy, or is there anything in that?
That's a really, really big question. Your question brings up for me curiosity that I've had around how the corporatization of higher education, particularly, post-Reagan years, as we see the rise of corporate power and monopolies and all of these things happen, how that's being reproduced within higher education, how the number of administrators like balloon versus like faculty, how the conversations around union and labor and all of these different things, that's all a part of the constellation of this conversation. And so I think your question points more toward this neoliberal university model that's highly corporate, that wants to reproduce class oppression through assigning people on these like tracks of identity. And they always originate with who had access to the test prep, as you said, it's not about actual like learning and intellect and skill and exploration. It's just about who had a warm bed and food at night, and now you get to be the boss of something. And so I look toward experiments in education, like Maroon University, for example, doing really, really cool things, or like the Justice Portal, doing work to figure out how do we create these points of intervention, whether it's in like material ways or narrative shifts that change how the university functions. I think about folks in some of our organizers who are working on getting open source textbooks so that folks aren't having to pay for textbooks and they're sharing PDFs. I'm thinking about popular education and how folks are sort of like queering the professor-student relationship and really trying to change how we learn and grow together. And I think the more and more we do that, then we have this inside-outside strategy, right? Of people are building new things on the outside, like Maroon University, and then those who are embedded on the inside are creating this critical mass of transformation that then when the standard is a pro-privatized, pro-corporate education, it no longer stands, right? It's no longer desirable. And that's long-term culture shift and understanding how racial capitalism is being reproduced within higher education, and then be accountable for that and make changes. But there's no group more invested in the idea of racial capitalism staying firmly in place with the university than Charles Koch and the folks that he's in deep relationship with.
want to go back to this narrative shift thing that the backlash against critical race theory that we've seen in the last year or two. And as you noted, Koch Network has funded communications and narrative work and all this other stuff to advance this idea that looking at our race history is somehow not a legitimate lens. And so there was this guy, Christopher Rufo, who is this blogger in Seattle who somehow rose to the top as somebody who was an opponent of critical race theory. He called it the perfect villain. And he has managed to use language and communications in a way that has deeply destabilizing and troubling effects. What, if anything, can we learn about how to define a narrative in a way that promotes and progresses, rather than to define a narrative in a way that, as you had said before, creates doubt or a small cadre of opponents that is enough to destabilize a movement?
Yeah. Well, I want to be really sophisticated in how we have this part of the conversation, because if you ask representatives of any of Charles Koch's directly funded entities like Charles Koch Foundation or Stand Together, which tries to paint itself as a progressive, whatever, spoiler alert, they're not. They're doing the exact same thing that Charles Koch Foundation did. They would say that they don't support the banning of ideas. It's against their faux libertarian front to support banning any idea. They would say that. But the reality is, though they don't directly say, I'm funding this to support the banning of ideas, they support all of the bases and the folks who do ban ideas, right? So it's like the difference between, it's this communications trap that if people aren't more sophisticated in how they view it, they always win this ground, right? So it's like saying, I didn't rob the bank, I just bought them the van and the guns, and I helped them print the map, but I didn't do it, right? So it's not my fault. So for moving into the Chris Rufo thing, which, Lord have mercy, I never thought I would have to hear that person's name so much. But it's just it's a Trojan horse, right? It's the fear that if you can, without directly saying, I'm afraid that the white race is going to be destroyed, like the whole Aryan fear of we're going to lose this, white society. You can say it without saying it, then you have power with conservative, evangelical, white nationalist movements. And so that's really what that's about. I think our work, other than understanding that this is a thing that appeals, is figuring out how we, with principle and rigor, speak to the true believers in a way that doesn't isolate them, but gives them an opportunity to belong. And again, I'm not talking about holding white fragility or honoring the needs and well-being of flagrant racists above Black and brown lives. But the work here is to make the idea of coming away from that undesirable. It's to say that we actually will create a site of belonging where you can belong in your full self. Because right now, these masses of folks, they're afraid of not belonging. And so they're drinking in this myth of be like the billionaires. This is the idea of ultimate freedom, that if you have any identity other than your very whitewashed, ahistorical identity, if you have to accept that maybe even if it wasn't your choice, you were born into a legacy of violence by just the proxy of who you are as a person in the world, that's a lot to hold. And so why critical race theory becomes so powerful, this perfect enemy situation, is that it allows the cognitive dissonance where you don't have to do your internal conscious work, you don't have to grow, and you don't have to face the deepest fear that most of us have, which are inherently unworthy, right? This to me is, yes, it's a political conversation of tactics and organizing and communication, but ultimately this is what my Black Indigenous elders would say is it's a soul problem. It is people who have been disconnected from their humanity and they only know violence. And so how do you keep someone How do you hold someone with grace and care and challenge them to move into a place of accountability if all they've known is violence, if they're just such, like I said, this true believer kind of posture? Well, we know if someone's in a cult, telling them they're in a cult is not going to help them. No, but creating places of belonging and care and staying in relationship with them does help them. So I guess in a way, what I'm beating around the bush to say is that it's an abolitionist future. It's a vision where there's not punishment, where we talk about impact and accountability. We have a lot of libertarian trolls who on our Twitter, and they'll come to us and be like, oh, okay, congratulations, trying to find utopia. So you're saying you're not evil? And for us, it's not a conversation of good or evil. As Prentice Hemphill says, we are striving to let go of the idea of innocence versus guilt. This is about impact and transformation. And the reality is that, like, Charles Koch and the folks who he appeals to, their impact deepen like pathways to deepen oppression. And so if we're trying to do something different, have to completely reimagine how we go about doing this work with them.
Well, you mentioned giving everybody a sense of belonging. We've spoken to John Powell on this show, and he is a friend, and I really look up to him. I certainly see that is an important way through. Yeah. And I guess the bigger question for all of us is, how do we create belonging among people with whom on the surface we really disagree on, or at least we disagree to some actions. But I mean, if we understand that we're all members of the human race, and if we are going to survive as a human race, we're going to have to figure out a way to come together across these differences, which is, again, the center of much of what John talks about. Where do you see that? Where do you see the first step at that? How do you bring somebody who might be susceptible to, a Rufo, and help them understand that there is a broader, better community to belong to?
Well, I mean, for us at UnKoch, right, we're the disrupt part, the intervene and disrupt part of the total landscape. But one of the things that we have been quietly building, and this is not public, this is the first time I'm saying this, and I'll give you the tea here, is we've created another entity, which will be the new home of UnKoch, called the Common Good Generation. And so disrupting and intervening is so important, because there are some who are going to be like, whoa, I didn't know what I was doing. Thank you for telling me. And then they go a different direction, right? But for others, it's a longer game. And so the vision of the Common Good Generation is to reimagine and transform institutions of public education so they serve the people, and they become gems of our community. And so I think that, for me, is the answer of, like, how do we invite these folks into space, not based on our shared oppression, but like our shared vision of the future, which includes safety, dignity, and belonging. And so I think for these Rufo people, it's about being consistent with our messaging. It's about being cohesive as well. And then just, it's protracted, it's long-term. Many of them want to have different ways, but they don't have exposure to different ways. And the only way to do that is to take the risk of, like, being vulnerable and being present with them. And so I often am in the same places and spaces as Koch-funded folks. I, have had relationships with academics who took Koch funding with the intention of, we don't, breaking relationship and isolating is only actually creating more of the conditions that help Charles Koch's ultimate world come to vision, right? But there are some people that it's not my ministry to love in that way, and Rufo might be one of them.
Outside the boundaries of the ministry. Well, yeah. I want to be in your ministry, Jasmine. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your work. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing what you continue to work on, and hope we stay in touch.
Well, I hope it was useful and that your listeners enjoy it. And I'm always open for feedback and critique and assessments. So folks can definitely reach out to me if they have ideas. But I hope that ultimately folks are taking from this that these flashpoints where we experience these deep culture wars they're intentional. They're not because of the people on the grounds. Like, we are not in our communities looking at ways to fight each other. It's a very, very small percentage of ultra wealthy people with a lot of power who are invested in the idea of continuing to create these schisms between us. Because if we're fighting each other, then we don't have the space and time and forethought to change the systems that they're benefiting from. And I absolutely believe it's possible for folks to transform and to step into centered accountability. And I'm just looking forward to the days where the piece that I wrote in The Nation is not necessary. Unfortunately, I've got a K through 12 one coming up. I've got a repro rights. The Koch network just, paid to ban gender affirming care through think tanks here in Arkansas, which really hit home for me. We had to organize to protect our oldest daughter because the Heritage Foundation tried to move their agenda here in Arkansas. And none of our legislators cared about gender affirming medical care until Heritage came to them. And then suddenly they banned our health care for our kids. And thankfully we've got to stay and we're doing some base building on the ground. But I just want everyone to understand that, like, we're not in this moment where we hate each other more or our differences are dividing us deeper. We're in a moment where systemic structural power understands it's on its final breath and other worlds are being birthed. And this tension and this constriction, this conflict is calling us to get to know each other better. So anyway, thank you so much for creating a platform where we can share that message.
Well, thank you for sharing it. Jasmine Banks, the executive director of UnKoch My Campus. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And we're back. Okay, so I have to say, this is one of the first times I just felt a deep sense of frustration with our podcast format, because this is a 30-minute conversation. It's totally
great.
Jasmine. Oh my gosh. I was listening to it thinking, I'm so grateful that there are people like Jasmine Banks in the world, doing this work. And there are so many layers of this conversation.
Same.
That you can go through. And I think that you did an excellent job of sort of covering the train, but everything from Jasmine's personal story that brings Jasmine to this work, let alone the sort of research that brought her to the Koch brothers and thinking about that work, and then the role of issues like critical race theory. How did it feel for you going through this interview? Because it was quite a journey. And I feel like this is chapter 1 of like a 10-chapter book is honestly my feeling about it. There's so much in here.
Well, I always like to know the people who are doing the work, and I like to know what their story is, because I think you learn as much about an issue from the story of the person as you do from the study of the issue. It's so brave to be taking on the Koch machine.
Yeah.
And to do it with the kind of passion that Jasmine brings to it, that I'm inspired by it. And it's fascinating because you and I have had this conversation. I've had this conversation with a million people where you start looking at this backlash against critical race theory, which, explains how social and economic differences between the races are created by the legal system rather than by the actions of individuals or psychological factors. And so you go, oh, wait a minute. So the legal system is now the thing that we use to hold up those institutions that were created through racist systems, slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, the whole thing. And the idea that all of a sudden somebody digs up an old textbook that looks at the effect of race and racism on our legal system and other aspects of our society, and now finds that's the demon, that's the thing that we get that people on the right get to hate, and then those folks get funded, and then they end up on Fox News, and all of a sudden you go, oh, this is how you manufacture difference, hatred, and all that stuff. To try and expose that, I think, is brave, and it's exciting. And also teaches all of us who work in communications about how that stuff happens, and then hopefully what you get to do about it.
So define this phrase for us, narrative shift. Define it. What is it? How would you characterize it? Because it's at the heart of this conversation, and I think it's so interesting to hear about the work that UnKoch My Campus and others are doing to live in this world of narrative shift and how difficult it must be. So how would you define it? How would you characterize it?
So everybody, thanks. Define being.
Yeah, right. Define is.
Okay, so right. Depends on what the meaning of the word is.
Right.
So narrative. So this is interesting because among other things, I'm on the board of the Narrative Initiative. So I should be able to define what narrative shift is or what narrative is. I mean, narrative is the stories we tell. And when in my own mind and my own thinking on this has evolved this week, what I think that the goal of a narrative is to create or establish a norm, which is that on any issue, you could have a norm that everybody that we should remove all the barriers to success, that equality of opportunity has to mean just that. And you do that through a series of stories or other ways that help create that norm. And I think that when we try to identify or create narratives that establish these norms in people's minds, that's how you start to shift how people act, what they do, what their politics are, and that sort of thing. It actually changes your brain chemistry, as Dan Kahneman has written in the past. And that's what Travian Shorters takes advantage of, understanding how even the words you use or the way you think about things changes your own perspective about somebody in unconscious ways. So the benefit of changing narrative is in changing these norms and these unconscious views of things. And the act of it, this story that you tell, becomes a story that we can all relate to, connect with, and understand.
So somebody from Koch Enterprises, this is just a crazy idea, total fiction. But if somebody from Koch Enterprises was willing to come onto our podcast and talk about their strategies, not their goals and aspirations, not their values, but their strategies for doing narrative shift from where they're coming from, would we listen to them? And here's why I ask, because Jasmine said something so interesting in your discussion where she said, I had been doing all this work and doing all this thinking, and I found the Koch brothers at the heart of all these issues I cared about. They were at the heart of climate. They were at the heart of education and reform. They were at the heart of all this intersection of all these issues. And I was thinking about this. Here's this enterprise that huddled in a room 50 years ago, which is another part of why this is a multi-chapter conversation. Because so what do they have going on here? They have time. They have strategy. And then they have this approach that says, you know what? We're not going to knock down any one of these things individually. We're going to do something with narrative that wraps it all up in a bundle so that regardless of what perspective of progressive and social change you're talking about, you're going to run into our barriers and obstacles. And I just think that there's something insidious, awful, horrible, but also just kind of profoundly interesting about that sensibility. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't want to talk to them. I don't. I don't need to.
It's the strategy. It's about the strategy. I get it. I totally get it.
I understand. I don't have any room in my soul with left of my
Jasmine
soul
called them the Death Star. Charles Koch was the Death Star at the center of all of these issues. And it's a really interesting sensibility, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. You study what has been effective, particularly things that have been effective against you, and you understand. But the other thing is that the left, the brain of the left and the brain of the right is different.
Yeah.
And I know, I don't want to get too into this, but the idea is, let's put it this way. It is so much easier to sow discontent and to engage on people's fears than it is to build and weave and work towards hope. And what I think progressive institutions are trying to do, and people are trying to do the latter, which is harder to do. I could start a fight with anybody at any time by sowing discontent. That's easy. And all you have to do is destabilize. And so if you're a big industrialist and your job is to keep people discontented so that they'll buy your stuff or that they won't do what you need to do in order to deal with climate change, or you won't do what you need to do in order to address the problems of racism, it's really easy, relatively easy to sow discontent. It's very hard to govern. And sometimes it's even hard to win electoral majorities, which is why folks are making it harder to vote. Is why they're
Right.
making it harder to to do all the redistricting in such a way. They're keeping them, you're gerrymandering the districts and all that other crap. So that's easy.
Yeah.
And so that's I don't need to know how to do that. I already know how to do that. I just don't because that's not what I'm about. So maybe that's my way. If somebody was on the other side creating some sort of new wonderful vision for their terrible world, that I'd be more interested in.
Yeah. Well, I like Jasmine
Exhausted.
described it as
Get me all
moral
spun up.
panic. They inspire moral panic
That's
with
right.
the way that they were.
Totally
and
right.
just, and it's so heartbreaking. So there's so many pieces to get into on this. And this is why I think this is a multi-part conversation, but I do want to leave you with, and by the way, you had a great Eric Brown moment in the conversation about selective versus restrictive universities.
Oh yeah,
And
no,
this
I'm on
notion of
that.
the very selective get to go to the selective schools and everybody else gets, and Jasmine, this perspective that, education is a public good and we're privatizing this public good through this enormous debt that people are having to carry as private debt. It's just, there's so much nuance and rich fodder for conversation there. But let's leave on this notion about critical race theory. Christopher Rufo, R-U-F-O, and just this notion that you can invent a conflict and critical race theory becomes the perfect villain and an entire messaging apparatus grows up to carry that forward. I feel like just deconstructing that process is worthy of multiple rounds of conversation.
Rufo. I don't want to talk about Rufo either, but yeah, that was it. Like easy. Here's some schmo up in Seattle who picks on a thing. They fill him with money and they put him on Vox, and all of a sudden he picked himself a good villain, and that was that.
Well, and there's a great article in the New Yorker about that work from last June,
right?
And it's titled "How a Conservative Activist Invented the Conflict Over Critical Race Theory," and is a conversation well worth having. Well, Jasmine Banks and the UnKochMyCampus.org, thank you so much for your work. You can follow them on Twitter at UnKoch, K-O-C-H, UnKoch Campus. And Jasmine, just what a warrior, what just terrific work. What a leader. And I just so excited to follow you and all of your work and just so deeply appreciative of everything you're bringing to it. It's so exciting.
Thank you, Jasmine. You're a rock star.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time and let's hear it. Okay, everybody, that's it for this episode. Please let us know if you have any thoughts about what you heard today or people we should have on this show, and that definitely includes yourself. And we'd like to thank
John Beltrano, our enthusiastic production assistant.
John Ali, the tuneful and inspiring composer of our theme music.
Our sponsors, the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
And please check out Lumina's terrific podcast, Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, and you can find that at luminafoundation.org.
We certainly thank today's guest and, of course, all of you.
And most importantly, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Oh, no. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Okay, everybody, until next time.
Let's hear it.